Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me back at ICT. It's a real honor, and it's a special privilege to be with all of you today, coming from Manhattan. Let me simply say why I'm here. Number one, the privilege to be invited back, and of course, to be back in Israel. But the Manhattan DA's office, which is an elective office, and I was elected in 2010, and I'm the head elected law enforcement official for Manhattan, is a unique criminal justice institution. It's really unlike any other prosecutor's office in the country. We have about 535 lawyers who work in my office. And the reason that we have so many, even though Manhattan is such a relatively geographic small environment, is the volume, the breadth, and the variety of cases that come through our office. Each year in our office, we handle more than 100,000 criminal cases in our courts. And to give you a point of reference, that is more criminal cases in a year than the entire federal government's Department of Justice handles nationwide. Now, many of those cases are, of course, of a purely local nature: rape, robbery, murder, and violent crime. But because we are situated in one of the financial capitals of the world, we also are deeply involved in economic crime. We are deeply involved in issues related to interruption of terrorist funding, which I'll speak about shortly. And obviously, we have also been the victim of one of the most significant terrorist attacks in recent memory. And so our office and my office has now a responsibility to deal both with local issues but global issues. And so that's why the Manhattan DA is so pleased to be able to come and address this group of distinguished Israelis, lecturers, academics, politicians from around the world, and give you a little bit of my thoughts on the challenges we all face. Of course, today is a day of remembrance in my country, and especially in New York. We today gather to honor the dead and remember the past. And it's a day when we also reflect very concretely on how our nation changed since September 11th of 2001. And you all, if you were not there, certainly remember by television on the day when the planes were hijacked and hit the World Trade Center, Americans were totally blindsided, caught completely off guard as a country. It seems unbelievable as we sit here today that in 2001, most Americans could not have identified the name Osama bin Laden, and they'd never heard of Al-Qaeda. No one came to work in Manhattan on that morning of September 11. It's a beautiful, clear morning, even fleetingly or remotely thinking of a possible terrorist attack. But of course, within hours, two of our country's most iconic buildings had come down. Thousands were dead, and even the head of our military installation, the Pentagon, had been hit directly. And of course, in a small field outside in the country, in the state of Pennsylvania, United Airlines Flight 93 was forced down by its passengers to prevent the terrorists from using the plane to attack our nation's capital. Even on September 11 itself, Americans had begun to fight back, and we've been fighting back ever since. Beginning the next day, every American carried an American flag. And throughout the world, we thank you. There was an enormous outpouring of support. One major European newspaper famously declared on that day, "We're all Americans now." But as time unfolded, it became clear, at least to me, that in some sense, we are all Israelis now. And that's because, in the aftermath of September 11, Americans, like Israelis, no longer had the luxury of being naive about the realities of war and terrorism. President John F. Kennedy recognized this about Israel many years ago. Israel, President Kennedy said, carries the shield of democracy and the sword of freedom. The shield and the sword. And those words seem very far-sighted to us today, equally for the United States and for Israel, as they reflect our responsibility to protect our democratic values and to carry the battle to the enemy. The people you all gathered in this room know exactly what I mean. In Israel, there's nothing abstract about fighting terrorism. And like Israel, New York remains a target for acts of terrorism. New York is also a world financial center, so it is also a center for movement of money that may be associated with terrorism funding. And because of those realities, when I was sworn in as the District Attorney of Manhattan in January of 2010, I promised to make the fight against terrorism one of my top priorities, and Israel is an essential partner in that fight. Today, I'd like to outline for you the steps we are taking in the Manhattan DA's office to prevent another terrorist attack, and what we, of course, are focused on as a local prosecutor's office particularly is domestic terrorism and lone wolf attacks, which I'll talk about. And we've seen this even in the time since I've been district attorney in two particular cases. In June of 2011, our office announced the indictment, which is the beginning of the criminal process in America after presentation of evidence to a grand jury, of two homegrown alleged terrorists for purchasing weapons to use in attacks on synagogues, guns and grenades. The arrests in the case were thanks to the work of an informant working with our office, and particularly with the New York City Police Department, for whom I have nothing but the highest praise for their work in combating terrorism. And in November 20 of 2011, our office charged an American citizen with conspiring to build a bomb for terrorist purposes. A bomb that's, as alleged in the indictment, he learned how to build entirely online, which speaks to the Member of Parliament's point that the ability of al-Qaeda and foreign entities to radicalize individuals in far-flung countries cannot be ignored, and it is something that we need to take with the greatest seriousness. That arrest, again, was as a result of working through an informant with the NYPD. And with respect to threats within New York City, in summary, we now believe that anti-terrorist enforcement, particularly in these local domestic terrorism situations, works best if it's an extension of proven crime-fighting strategies that we've employed for decades around our country. One of the great lessons of September 11, and it was indeed a lesson that had been taking shape for some time, is that proactive, intelligence-based policing and prosecution to prevent violent crimes before they happen informs not just our work against street crime, but is one of our most effective tools to combat terrorism. I would suspect that that approach resonates with many of you in this audience, not just those in law enforcement. I've given much thought to the remarkable book by Dan Signor and Saul Singer entitled Startup Nation. And the story the book relates is familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. It is about Israel's dynamism, and the book argues, in a nutshell, at least to this one American, that that dynamism is largely due to an attitude that values innovation and independent initiative, where respect is accorded more to results than to rank. And in New York, innovation in our law enforcement has led to a method of investigation and prosecution called smart policing and smart prosecution. And we focus less today on the traditional measures of success, like numbers of arrests and cases tried in our courthouse. And we focus more on strategies that are designed to long-term prevent and reduce crime and create real improvements in the security and quality of the communities we're privileged to serve. And as it pertains to our battle in New York City and our office against terrorism, the key here is partnering with our local, our federal, and even our international authorities to detect and prosecute terrorist plots within our borders at inception. Now, I told you about the number of cases that we handle each year, more than 100,000. That number reflects now that we have hundreds of assistant district attorneys looking at defendants coming through our court system every day and putting them through the justice system. And that means with that 100,000 cases, we have a unique opportunity in Manhattan to evaluate whether any of those charged in those 100,000 cases, and they range, of course, from credit card fraud to sales of weapons to drug possession to possession of stolen property, cybercrime, whether they are somehow linked to terrorist activity or funding. Combined with this intelligence-based approach to law enforcement, we of course have 35,000 New York City police officers on every street corner in New York City during the course of a day. That's 35,000 sets of eyes and ears on the streets of New York City. And someone once asked the question, who would be more likely to prevent a domestic terrorist attack in New York City? Would it be the FBI? Would it be the Department of Defense? Or would it be the New York City Police Department? And I believe in this modern era, particularly as it pertains to local domestic terrorism, it would of course be the NYPD, who are literally infused in every neighborhood in our communities, on the ground, learning real time in each community about what's transpiring. The relevance of what we find in evaluating these 100,000 cases can be of incalculable value, and not just to us in New York. We've learned from experience that a tip we may turn up in Manhattan could lead to information relevant to a plot in Toronto or even Israel. So the real critical question for a modern prosecutor's office like ours in the year 2012 is, are we using and accessing all the information that comes to us as a result of the great volume of cases that process through our courts effectively, not just to prosecute those cases individually after a crime's been committed, but even more importantly, are we accessing the intelligence to identify threats and contain them before the bomb explodes or a life is lost? Or as the Americans now commonly ask, are we connecting the dots? In the cases that are being prosecuted by my office that I mentioned earlier, the synagogue plot and the bomb maker, I think the answer is yes. We connected the dots. They were homegrown terrorist plots that were preemptively foiled within our subway, within a subway wide of where they began. And in each instance, it was real-time intelligence and undercover actors who enabled us to identify the threat, build a legal case to bring it to court, and eliminate the threat before it actually occurred. But intelligence gathering and smart prosecution and policing are just one part of the strategy. Now, in medieval times, map makers placed this region at the center of the world. But in modern times, I think we in New York can make the good case that we live at the center of the 21st century world. Osama bin Laden certainly thought so. New York City is a symbol of world freedom, a center of international commerce and culture, and, thankfully, a beacon for immigrants and entrepreneurs from all around the globe. And that brings me to the second part of our fight against terrorism, following and stopping the money. Mindful of the international scope of terrorism, we use New York's location as the center of world commerce to detect and thwart efforts to finance terrorist conspiracies, rogue regimes, and weapons of mass destruction. Financing a terrorist organization, a regime, or purchases of materiel for weapons of mass destruction requires, of course, the movement of money. And these movements of money, of course, often leave traces in New York, which is the center of finance and banking. And sometimes our office is able to detect those transactions actually. Other times, we're able to detect efforts to disguise those transactions. But in either case, our efforts enable us to thwart terrorist operations, sometimes far from our borders. And even where our financial investigations don't give rise to a prosecution, we still have a role to play. In one investigation, for example, our office tracked tens of millions of dollars of suspicious funds flowing to accounts in Pakistan, Lebanon, Jordan, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And much of that money was very difficult to trace, but we obtained authorization to share that information with the Israeli Defense Forces. And the IDF was able to trace a portion of the funds that originated in the jungles of Paraguay to accounts in this region. And the accounts were used to pay the families of suicide bombers, so-called shaheed. And the Israeli authorities were able to use this evidence to build a case that they were able to act upon. Now, that's not a case where the Manhattan DA could bring criminal charges against anyone, but the work that we did and were proud to do and to assist in helped identify terrorist financing networks elsewhere. In our initiatives against international terrorism, we've also adapted a lesson we learned from fighting international narcotics trafficking and organized crime. Seizing funds can be among our most effective weapons in crippling a terrorist organization. In August of 2010, we reached a settlement with Barclays Bank in the UK for its mishandling of wire transfers and transactions and records on behalf of countries subject to American sanctions like Iran, Libya, and Sudan. The most recent was just this past July with ING Bank, which settled for $619 million and strict changes in internal controls related to money movement. Now, thanks to these and other investigations that we've done in our office working in partnership with our federal partners, the settlements we've reached have prevented hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars from entering the pipeline to rogue regimes. We've resolved 5 of these cases in the last 4 years. And we have more cases to come in this area, I assure you. The billions of dollars that we've achieved in settlements with these foreign banks get the headlines. But what's most important is that the foreign banks now know that there is a consequence to failure to adhere to international sanctions with regard to doing business with countries like Iran. And it has brought foreign banks to actually self-report to law enforcement authorities in America if, in the exercise of their due diligence, they find money movement that violates sanctions that may be related to terrorist activity. Whenever we disrupt a chain of financing, we reap potential benefits for intelligence operations. If one bank or shell corporation is removed from the pipeline that a terrorist organization uses to move funds, another, usually too promptly, takes its place. And it's during that period of adaptation that we may be able to identify the parties moving the money or the material used for terrorism. And something like that occurred in our recent investigation of the Islamic Republic of Shipping Lines, known as IRISL. In 2008, sanctions were imposed on IRISL, and for 2 very good reasons. First, the shipping lines were a major source of revenue for the Iranian regime. And second, the ships themselves were being used to transport the ingredients of Iran's nuclear programs. Iran's response was simple. It changed the ownership in name only of most of their vessels to avoid the sanctions, creating shell companies and corporate alter egos to hide their identities and defraud U.S. banks into doing business with them. But we were able in our office, with help from partners from around the globe, to pierce the veils of these reflagged vessels in order to indict in our New York courts and hopefully bring to justice those who sought to circumvent these sanctions. And in so doing, not only did we help put the teeth into international sanctions, we gained valuable intelligence about aspects of Iran's proliferation efforts, intelligence we were able to share with our partners. And this sort of prosecution is relatively new, but it uses a concept familiar to law enforcement organizations, monitoring activity such as wiretaps, to gain new intelligence. Because when we make a seizure of drugs or money, the response of that organization, sometimes recorded on tap phones, often provides the most incriminating evidence to use at trial, helping us to identify the responsible and the roles they play in their organization. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've come to appreciate that although I am a local prosecutor in Manhattan, many, many thousands of miles away from here, number one, we are your allies in the fight against terrorism. Number two, our role and involvement in this arena is not just local, but is indeed aggressively international. Because, as many distinguished speakers with greater knowledge than me have already said, if we are going to be effective in implementing sanctions, which are, of course, a necessity in this era as we try to combat terrorism, this has to be done by coordination. My office has a role to play. We are proud to play that office. We are proud to partner with Israel, and we will continue to do so in every way that we can for the future. Thank you.